Today, we are diving into one of the most brilliant, baffling, and honestly, game-changing books of 20th century philosophy, Ludwig Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. Now, get this. It's a short book, right? But it claims to solve all the problems of philosophy. How? Well, by arguing that most of them were never really problems to begin with. Let's get into it. So, right out of the gate, Wittgenstein drops this absolute bombshell. He's not just saying that centuries of brilliant philosophers were wrong. No. He's saying they weren't even making sense, that they were, quite literally, speaking nonsense. I mean, talk about a bold claim, right?
And that really is the big question, isn't it? How on earth could giants like Plato or Kant have just been spouting gibberish? It sounds crazy, but for Wittgenstein, it all came down to a massive, fundamental misunderstanding of what language can, and more importantly, what it can't do.
To really get what Wittgenstein was trying to do, you gotta think of him as kind of like a doctor for language. He saw philosophers as patients who had become sick, tying themselves in knots with their own words, creating these strange questions that had completely lost their connection to reality.
I mean, just look at a question like this. Is the good more identical than the beautiful? It sounds super deep, right? It has the shape of a profound philosophical question. But Wittgenstein would tell us to just stop and think. What fact in the world could possibly answer this? It's like a grammatical illusion. The words are there, but they don't actually hook onto anything real. They don't picture anything.
So his entire mission with this book was to draw a boundary, not around what exists in the world, but a boundary within language itself. He basically lays it all out in the preface. What can be said at all can be said clearly, and what we cannot talk about, we must pass over in silence.
Okay, so how do you draw a line like that? Well, Wittgenstein came up with this really powerful and elegant idea for how language gets its meaning in the first place. He called it the picture theory of language.
And this right here is the absolute heart of it. A meaningful sentence for Wittgenstein isn't just a string of words, it's a picture. It's a model of reality. But a picture of what exactly? This is a super important distinction he makes. The world, he says, isn't just a big pile of things, a cat, a mat, a book, whatever. The world is the sum of all the facts, and a fact is just how those things are arranged. The cat by itself isn't a fact, but the cat is on the mat, that is a fact. It's a state of affairs. So how does this whole picturing thing actually work? Let's use a simple example. Plato loves Socrates. Okay? The name Plato points to the person Plato. The name Socrates points to the person Socrates. And the way the word loves connects those two names in the sentence, well, that structure pictures a possible relationship between the actual people out there in the world. The sentence and the real-world situation share the same underlying blueprint, what he calls logical form.
Wittgenstein had this amazing analogy for it. Think about sheet music, the actual sound waves of an orchestra playing that music, and the grooves cut into a vinyl record. They are all physically completely different things, right? But they all contain the exact same symphony. Why? Because they all share the same logical structure. That's what a meaningful sentence does for a fact.
And boom, that gives us our boundary line. A sentence makes sense only if it pictures a possible state of affairs. If you can look at the world and say, yep, that picture's true, or nope, that picture's false, then you're dealing with a meaningful sentence. If you can't even imagine what you'd look for, well then it's nonsense.
Okay, so we've got our rule. Language can picture facts. Simple enough. But this is where things get really, really interesting. If language works by picturing what's in the world, what about the stuff that isn't in the world? What lies beyond the frame of the picture?
You know, think about a map. A map can show you the layout of all the streets in a city. But can the map show you what it means to be a map? Can it depict the very rules of scale and projection that allow it to represent the city in the first place? No way. That structure is something the map shows you, just by existing, but it's not something it can ever say or point to within its own borders.
And this brings us to the big idea in the whole book, the crucial difference between saying and showing. On one side, you have what can be said. These are facts about the world, the stuff of science. The cat is on the mat. But on the other side, you have what can only be shown, things like the logical form of the world itself, or the principles of ethics, beauty, and what Wittgenstein called the mystical.
This is probably the most famous line in the book, and it's really the whole key. We try to talk about goodness or beauty as if they're facts, like the cat being on the mat, but they're not. They're in a completely different category. Their nature can only be revealed or shown, not stated as a simple factual proposition.
So this all leads us to the book's completely mind-bending, paradoxical finale. Because if Wittgenstein's theory is right, then his own book has a massive, massive problem. Right? Think about it. He just spent this whole book making claims about the logical structure of language and reality. The very things he just finished arguing cannot possibly be said. So, by his own logic, isn't the entire book he just wrote nonsense?
And his answer is a shocking yes. Absolutely. He is 100% aware that his own book violates its own rules. He knows he's trying to say what can only be shown. He knows it's the ultimate paradox.
This was so radical that even his mentor, the legendary philosopher Bertrand Russell, was deeply confused by it. In his introduction to the book, Russell basically admits he's uncomfortable, pointing out that, for a guy who says some things are unsayable, Wittgenstein sure does manage to say a whole lot about them.
So how does Wittgenstein solve this puzzle? He gives us his most famous metaphor. His book, he says, is like a ladder. You have to use the propositions, the rungs, to climb up to get to a new perspective where you can see the world correctly. But once you've gotten to the top, once you see it, well, you don't need the ladder anymore. You have to kick it away. His sentences are just tools to get you to an understanding. Once you're there, you realize the tools themselves were never the point.
So what happens when you kick the ladder away? What do you find at the top? Well, you find the book's final, unforgettable conclusion.
This is the final proposition, and it isn't a sign of defeat or giving up. It's the destination. The whole point is to finally, clearly see the difference between what can be said, the world of science and facts, and what can only be shown, the world of ethics, meaning, and beauty. These things aren't nonsense. They're maybe the most important things there are, but their importance has to be lived and felt and experienced, not just talked about. And that really leaves us with a provocative thought, doesn't it? It forces us to ask ourselves, in our own lives, how often are we trying to force into words the very things that can only ever be truly demonstrated? What are we trying so hard to say when maybe we should be focusing on how to show it instead? It's a question that could change how we think about everything.